and welcome to the debut episode of Let's Hear It. This show developed from an Instagram series I did. My name is Gary Waldman. I am not a professional musician, but I work in the music industry, and I'm a enthusiastic collector of strange instruments. So while I was home not going on tour because of COVID, I dug out all my instruments, about 70 of them, that live with me in a 2-bedroom apartment in Manhattan, New York City, and made a series of, I would just like introducing those instruments to people. So I would tell a little bit about them and play a little example. So when I was nearing the end, I was a little bit sad that it wasn't going to be able to continue. So I came up with this idea of inviting some of my best pals and musicians that some of them you may know of, some of them maybe not, but just people who have instruments that they love and that are interesting instruments with stories and just something that is meaningful to the person who owns it. So today's episode is going to be about Rickenbacker guitars. Rickenbacker is an American company formed in California in the 1930s. They were one of the first companies that made an electric guitar. So they made steel guitars that you played on your lap with a slide that had a primitive electric pickup in it for guitarists who were playing in orchestras at the time who couldn't be heard without amplification. So that was the origin, the idea behind electric instruments. So then the 40s and 50s, they made some more. Their original guitar in the 30s was called a frying pan. We'll show you a picture of that. And then in the 40s and 50s, they developed more standard looking electric instruments. In the 50s, James Burton, who was Elvis Presley's guitar player, played one with Ricky Nelson on TV. And then the real moment where Rickenbackers came into the cultural mainstream was in 1964 on the Ed Sullivan Show, the debut performance of the Beatles, which changed music when they performed February 1964. John Lennon was playing a Rickenbacker guitar, 6-string. And then on their next appearance, George Harrison was playing a Rickenbacker 12-string. Subsequently, Paul McCartney played a Rickenbacker bass, and those were so influential to musicians, and particularly Roger McGuinn and David Crosby, who formed the Byrds. After they went to see the Beatles movie A Hard Day's Night, where they saw those Rickenbacker guitars, and they based the whole sound of the Byrds around those Rickenbacker 12-string and 6-string guitars. And the Beatles, the Byrds, were referred to as the American Beatles. They were an enormously successful band, defined the folk rock genre in the late 60s. And then subsequently, other musicians like John Fogerty from Creedence Clearwater Revival, people from the Jefferson Airplane, and then into the 70s, Tom Petty and Mike Campbell from Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers were hugely influenced by the Beatles and the Byrds, and they took up the Rickenbackers as well. And also bass players played the Rickenbackers. So I mentioned that Paul McCartney played one, and then Geddy Lee from Rush, Chris Squire from Yes, and then Peter Buck from REM also played a Rickenbacker guitar. And today's guest is Jon Graboff, who is a touring musician and studio musician. Some of his credits, he's played with Cyndi Lauper, Ryan Adams and the Cardinals for many years, Phil Lesh and Friends, and in the studio he's done sessions with Carrie Underwood, Ron Sexsmith, and many, many more. And the theme song you heard at the beginning of this show was written by Jon on his Rickenbacker 366 12-string. So we're going to bring Jon on, and he's going to show us that guitar, and we're going to hear what it sounds like, and he'll tell us a story about where he got that instrument and why it's one of his favorites. So say hello to Jon Graboff. Hi there, Jon, from Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Hey, Gary, how you doing? Good to see you.
I'm doing great. So tell us about this guitar, and tell us about what attracted you to a Rickenbacker 12-string.
Well, I can, of course, like everybody else, when you kind of, the first time you hear that first Byrds record, you go, holy moly, what the heck is that sound? It sounds so great. And then It captivated my imagination. I always loved the sound. Of course, a lot of Americans kind of had it backwards, where they thought that McGuinn's 12-string kind of influenced Harrison, but it was, as you mentioned, it was the other way around. I think McGuinn's told the story about him and Crosby going to see A Hard Day's Night in the movie theater when it first came out, and saw George Harrison play his 360-12 and go, I like that sound. We're gonna basically build the whole sound of the band around that sound, and it's been subsequently. It was the sound of so many records back then. Everything from the Beach Boys, Surfing USA, to Kicks by Paul Revere and the Raiders, and then of course, My Generation. I mean, there's so many sounds, and then have intros like. That's the sound. That is the sound. And I loved it.
Nice. And so tell us about the particular Rickenbacker that you have. Where'd you get it? And maybe show us a couple quick features of it.
Well, this guitar I bought at the Arlington, Texas Guitar Show about 25 years ago. I had been looking for a Rick 12. And I went there with a pal of mine, and we were walking through, and I saw this one booth that had this guitar on in the booth, and I went over and picked it up, and it wasn't cheap, but it wasn't crazy expensive. And the thing that was interesting about it was missing a part, and we'll get to that in a second. I'll talk about that in a second. But I picked it up. I didn't even, this is something a lot of guitar players ought to know. The best electric guitars that I've ever owned, I've never plugged in. I just listened to it acoustically, and if it sounded great, I knew if the pickups worked, it was a great guitar. So I said to the guy, I'm not going to plug it in. I did, actually I did this. Not plugged in. I said, the pickups work? The guy goes, yes, and I said, I'll buy it.
That was Mr. Tambourine Man, of course, from The Byrds, Bob Dylan's song.
That's the first thing anybody ever plays on one of these things. I mean, it's the sound of this instrument.
Yeah.
And but the interesting thing about it was that, well, this is kind of an oddball version of this guitar because it has this thing. It looks like the grill of a 52 DeSoto or something like that. And the concept of it was that you could move this thing and hook it around the octave strings and pull it down so it mutes those strings, so you would have a 6-string sound instead of a 12-string sound. Quite honestly, I've never used it. I have 6-string guitars that I like better, and of course with all 12 strings and 6 of them locked down against the fingerboard, you can't bend a string. So and they, for some reason, Rickenbacker made this model for a really long time, even though nobody ever really liked it. But everything else about the guitar is exactly what you want, so I overlooked that, and I said, oh, I don't really care. And so I bought the guitar, and I've had it ever since. I've used it on a zillion records, and it's a wonderful one. The interesting thing about it was that this comb thing, this converter thing, was missing when I bought the guitar. Everything else was there except this. I called Rickenbacker and I said, do you have any of those things? And they go, oh yeah, we got a whole drawer full of them. So I bought one, they sent it to me, and I could tell that it was from the original run of parts because there's a small casting defect. There's a slight diagonal line in the chrome on this thing, and every single one I've ever seen has that imperfection. So obviously they made this thing back in the day, had a drawer full of them. So I got to, I basically completed the look of the guitar, regardless of whether I actually use it or not.
Interesting. Any other fun facts about that guitar you want to tell us?
Well, the one thing, first of all, I just love the shape of it. I just think it's super, super sexy and very curvy and stuff. But the thing that Rickenbacker did, which I think was a real stroke of genius, was instead of having 6 tuners on each side of the headstock, which would make the headstock about that long, I always used to say you could be a hockey goalie with one of those things. Yeah. But what they did was they combined the features of a regular guitar, which has the tuners sticking out the side, with a post coming out the front. But they incorporated an older design of guitars, which was the slotted headstock, and you can see that right there. And so consequently, they could stagger the tuning pegs, so you would have a regular sized headstock instead of one that was twice as long. And those ones that, like Gibson electric 12 strings, the headstocks is long, they're very neck heavy. This just perfectly balances, and it was just a great insight into making a guitar totally functional and balanced and looks cool. They're a pain in the ass to change strings on, I gotta tell you that much. It's a full day experience, but on these guitars you don't change strings that often anyway, so it's sort of a moot point.
Yeah. Well, great. Rickenbacker is still based in California and still making that model, I believe. I don't know what they're like, but...
I don't know if they're actually still making the 366 with the converter, because as I said, it was never really all that popular, but It wouldn't surprise me if they still were, because they probably had a whole bunch of extra parts lying around that they didn't want to throw out.
There you go. That's the Let's Hear It theme. Well, thank you, Jon Graboff. Thank you for coming on.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Gary.
Thank everybody for watching this. You'll see a button on the YouTube channel to subscribe. We will be rolling out additional episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. So subscribe. You can watch on Facebook, YouTube. We'll have them up on Instagram as well. And the next episode will feature an instrument that I'll bet most of you have never seen. It's called a tona harp, and it was made in 1917, and my pal Steve Schiltz will be coming on and showing us that instrument. So thanks again, everybody, and see you soon.